With this session update, I'm Shannon Lurkey. The Senate's omnibus agriculture, housing, and broadband bill contains a provision that would cancel the rent control measures passed by the voters of St. Paul and Minneapolis last November. An amendment to remove it was offered but not adopted. Here are some highlights.
I invite people to look at what the language that we are deleting does in particular, but it is not in the particular. It is not in the particular that concerns us. It is an attempt to usurp the will of the people by denying, calling null and void an election that they took to determine their future. And they didn't ask the people of New Hope that I represent, or Brooklyn Center that Senator Eaton represents, or any of the rest of you to act on that. They asked us to accept their decision about their future and how they envision stability and housing in their communities.
Why am I so against rent control? Part of it has to do with the economic impact of the surrounding areas and the community that enacts rent control. And for those members that didn't study econ in college, this was the poster child of supply and demand. When they gave examples of supply and demand, they always talked about a widget, and then they talked about housing and the supply and demand of housing. And throughout the world, not just in North America, throughout the world, rent control has not worked. And what have they found when they studied rent control, which is probably the most studied aspect of housing, is that when you impose rent control on private property owners, that stops the growth of more housing units.
Issue is really local control and what the voters have decided, whether we agree with them or not. And 30,965 voters in the city of St. Paul, which was 52.89%, voted for rent stabilization.
The people of the two largest cities in Minnesota, just days after this bill would repeal their vote, they spoke. Their voice was heard. In a free and fair election, we have no right to retroactively rescind the voice of the people.
One of the things that I don't know that everyone realized when they voted for this, I've lived in St. Paul now for 6 years. I've never seen more than about a 3 or 4% increase. And on December 30th of this prior year, I got a note underneath my door for a 43.79% rent increase. I don't think that's what the St. Paul residents anticipated when they voted for this bill, or this passage of the rent control.
When you talk about those two housing markets and their impact, you're talking about the Twin Cities region. You're talking about an entire metropolitan area. You're talking about the state of Minnesota. And if we know, if there are studies out there, and if we have real-time data within just the last few months that show us that the creation of thousands of housing units have been stopped, completely halted, in the midst of a housing crisis when we need those units, when Minnesotans need those units desperately. And then we find out that building permits are down 80% in the city of St. Paul, when they are setting record highs in other parts of the state where rent control doesn't exist.
And think about that. The people who are going to invest in St. Paul have pulled their money out. But the people who had already invested in St. Paul, the people who already owned property, have had those rights taken away from them. This is not, this is like telling a restaurant that's been existing in your city, well, we know your food costs have gone up, but you can only raise your prices a certain percentage. We would never consider doing that. Sometimes the voters get it wrong. Sometimes the voters should not be voting on something. To me, this is a constitutional issue. This is a value of property rights. And we need to stand behind those values.
This speaks to the larger problem at hand with this amendment. And this speaks to the, I have to give credit, and I think Senator Dibble did this as well, to the transparency of what's going on here. It is to overturn a lawful election guaranteed in statute by a charter city to vote on their own rules. And we're saying as a body, or we're attempting to say as a body, that we don't agree with that vote. And because we don't like that vote, we're now going to use our power here at the Capitol to tell those people in the majority, you're wrong, and we're going to make it illegal, or we're going to take it away retroactively. Anybody in Legislative 101 knows retroactive bills are almost always a disaster, and this is precisely why.
You know, we have, and we do all the time, have statewide laws. The Constitution does give us rights. And we can talk about liberties and rights, but government exists to protect the individual rights. Rent control violates the property rights of the property owner. And in my opinion, it's taking from the individual.
There being 33 ayes and 34 nays, the motion does not prevail and the amendment is not adopted.
To continue following these issues and more, watch legislative coverage Monday through Friday on the PBS Minnesota channel or visit our website, www.senate.mn/media.